G'day, I'm Beth Fulton and I'd like to welcome you to the Atlantis Summit. Before we get rolling, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands we meet on. Here in Lutruwita, that's the Muanina people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and the leaders that are emerging today, and particularly to the traditional owners and custodians of the lands of Tasmania, the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. So when I first started making Atlantis 20 odd years ago, it was really just to connect the food web to fisheries, to consider that whole interconnected link rather than just a single species at a time. But through time it's grown to include more of the management loop, the different steps that you have to go about in sustainable fisheries, and then more recently to really consider that whole system, so the other users of the marine environment, the other industry, but also the population, the society and the economy and all the infrastructure and decision making that's around that. Across the world, there's more than 500 registered users for Atlantis, though there's a much smaller active user group, but it's been used in some really interesting ways around the world. For sure, fisheries is still the primary use, with some climate as well, but it's also been used to look at port development, oil and gas extraction, multiple use, sand mining, conservation, biodiversity, hydrocarbons. It's even been used in lakes to look at hypoxia and eutrophication. So the basic concept behind Atlantis is to represent each part of the adaptive management cycle, starting with the biophysical world here in blue, the different ways the humans use it through marine industries and the effects that they can have, the assessment and management decision-making processes back through the human-mediated social and economic parts of the world, so that you're closing each part of that adaptive management step in what's known as management strategy evaluation. Now, Atlantis has quite a lot of options to it so that you can switch in and out your different assumptions about how the world works and see how sensitive the outcomes are to that. And it doesn't try to optimize. It really just has the what happens under which kind of circumstance, so that you can say, look, I've got these objectives to the system, are they being met or not? So that means you can consider system structure and function, you can look at the impacts of large-scale change, you can check if your assessments are reliable, what kind of management decisions work, and when are they robust to uncertainty. And uncertainty is a really big part of it. It's one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time with Atlantis is how to represent uncertainty. So the way it's typically done is to look at different strategies or different scenarios, but then to try different parameterizations. Now, that's not done as much as we maybe would like, given that Atlantis can be really hard to use. I'm the first to admit that. But ultimately, that's the goal, to really look at that parameterization uncertainty, not just the different strategies and scenarios. But Atlantis can be misused, and I'm really conscious of the fact that because it's difficult, it is tempting to cut corners sometimes. But it's also, just because it's got a good reputation doesn't mean it should be used for everything. In fact, I spend most of my time telling people to use something else. It's certainly not appropriate for fine-scale biogeochemistry. For sure, it's got a plankton capacity in it. It's got a biogeochemical model in it. But it's not sort of cutting edge in that way. It's a little bit older kind of approach. It's a bit of a classical approach. And it's really chunky space. So it's really not appropriate for fine-scale water quality monitoring. And there are a lot better tools out there for that. It is pretty good for looking at large-scale strategic questions, but not very good, or at least not trustworthy, I think, enough at the level for tactical decisions and stock assessments. It has actually been used a little bit for that in Australia at some times, and they have absolutely no other information. But the reality is that there's a lot of other methods that have been developed that have quite a lot of predictive skill for those kind of assessments, and they should really be the most appropriate tool. The time it takes to make Atlantis also means it's not very suited for rapid assessments. And I'd really throw my hat in the ring behind size-based approaches and mice models of intermediate complexity, if you're really going to want to have a rapid assessment in a systematic sense. All of that also means that it shouldn't be the sole source of information. You know, there's lots of things that we're uncertain about Atlantis. It's way over-parameterized, and that fact we usually have way less data than our parameters in Atlantis. So it's much better to use an ensemble of models, so Atlantis along with other kinds of models, to make sure that the signals you're getting out of Atlantis are as reliable as possible. Now, I know that's not always something that you can do, but that's kind of where I like to lean. So that's a really whistle-stop tour of how Atlantis has been used to date and when it probably should be put to the side. But I'd really love to hear from you. So do you know of a use that I've missed? There's some really good exemplary applications, some textbooks, showcase applications you'd really like to plug? Are there warnings that you'd like to highlight about when you shouldn't use Atlantis or what to be aware of? And are there additional uses that we could use Atlantis for in the future that we have overlooked so far? Like I said, I'd really love to hear from you, so jump on Slack, look up the link, and please fill in the Google survey about how you think Atlantis can be used, how it's best used, and what should we do to avoid it. Thanks.